Hello, I'm Jessie, and welcome back to the Happiness Hippie podcast. There are some ideas that immediately make sense, and then there are others that feel almost disappointing the first time you hear them. Hedonic adaptation is one of those ideas. It suggests that no matter how exciting or difficult life becomes, most of us gradually return to a fairly familiar emotional baseline. The essay we're exploring today, What is Hedonic Adaptation? How to Step Off the Happiness Treadmill, asks whether that tendency is something we should simply accept or whether we can learn to work with it more wisely. I'm joined by the author, and I found this essay surprisingly hopeful. At first glance, it sounds as though happiness is always slipping away from us. But the deeper message is almost the opposite. It suggests that understanding how the mind adapts allows us to stop chasing happiness in the wrong places and begin cultivating it in ways that actually last.
It's great to be here, Jessie. I think that's exactly why this subject matters. Most people have experienced hedonic adaptation without ever hearing the name. They've worked hard for something, finally achieved it, and felt genuinely happy for a while. Then, perhaps weeks or months later, they discover that the excitement has faded and ordinary life has quietly returned. That experience often creates unnecessary self-criticism. People wonder whether they are becoming ungrateful or whether they somehow chose the wrong goal. In many cases, neither is true. They're simply experiencing a very normal psychological process. Once we understand that process, we stop blaming ourselves for being human and start asking better questions about how happiness actually works.
I think that's what surprised me most while reading the essay. We've all heard people say, "I'll be happy when. I'll be happy when I earn more money. I'll be happy when I move house. I'll be happy when I retire. I'll be happy when I lose weight." The assumption underneath those statements is that a future event will permanently change how we feel. But according to hedonic adaptation, that isn't usually what happens.
That's right. Major life events absolutely matter. They can bring tremendous joy or profound grief. The mistake is believing that those emotional peaks or valleys will remain at the same intensity indefinitely. Human beings adapt remarkably well. It's one of our greatest strengths. We adapt to success, and we adapt to hardship. The nervous system recalibrates. What once felt extraordinary gradually becomes familiar. That capacity protects us. Imagine if grief remained at its most intense level forever. Most people wouldn't be able to function. Adaptation allows healing. The challenge is that the same mechanism also reduces the emotional intensity of positive experiences. The new car becomes just a car. The promotion becomes the new normal. The house you dreamed about becomes the place where you leave dirty dishes in the sink.
That image made me smile because it's so true. Most of us can probably think of something we desperately wanted a few years ago that now feels completely ordinary. What's interesting is that the object hasn't changed. We have.
Exactly. And that distinction is important. The object isn't responsible for creating permanent happiness because the mind is always adjusting to what becomes familiar. Once something becomes part of everyday life, attention shifts elsewhere. The mind begins looking for the next improvement. That isn't because we're greedy, it's because our psychology evolved to notice change. Stability becomes background. Novelty captures attention.
The essay mentions the famous research comparing lottery winners with people who had experienced serious accidents. That's one of those studies that tends to surprise people because the long-term differences in reported happiness were much smaller than most of us would predict. Why do you think those findings continue to matter?
Because they challenge one of our strongest assumptions. Most people instinctively believe that external circumstances determine long-term happiness. We imagine that extraordinary good fortune permanently transforms emotional life. We also imagine that tragedy permanently destroys it. The research suggests something more nuanced. Circumstances matter enormously, but human beings possess a remarkable ability to adapt. that doesn't trivialize suffering or success. It simply reminds us that our emotional lives are more dynamic than we often assume.
One thing I appreciated was that the essay never argues against ambition. Sometimes conversations like this drift toward the conclusion that goals don't matter, or that we should stop striving altogether. That isn't your position at all.
No, because ambition isn't the problem. Growth is healthy. Learning new skills is worthwhile. Improving your circumstances can absolutely improve your quality of life. The problem appears when we ask achievement to do something it cannot do. If we expect external success to permanently satisfy an internal longing, disappointment becomes almost inevitable. Goals should enrich life, not become the sole source of emotional stability.
That leads naturally into the idea of the happiness treadmill. I think it's such a useful metaphor because treadmills create movement without much change in location. You're working hard, but psychologically you often end up back where you started.
That's precisely why psychologists began using that expression. Imagine constantly moving the finish line. You finally arrive, celebrate briefly, and then immediately begin looking towards the next destination. That process can continue for decades. The difficulty isn't the movement, it's the assumption that the next milestone will finally deliver lasting contentment. Many people become trapped in a cycle where they never fully inhabit the present because they're mentally living in the next achievement.
Modern culture probably doesn't help. Everything encourages upgrading. Better technology, bigger homes, higher income, more followers, better productivity, better performance. There's always another version of success waiting just ahead.
There is, and none of those things are inherently bad. The difficulty arises when external upgrading replaces internal development. If our ability to appreciate life never grows, then every improvement eventually becomes ordinary. That's why the essay argues that shifting internal habits changes the experience far more than endlessly accumulating external improvements.
One of those internal habits is gratitude, although you describe it in a way I found refreshing. You don't present gratitude as pretending everything is wonderful or ignoring hardship.
Because that's not gratitude. Real gratitude isn't forced positivity. It's an attentional practice. Our attention naturally gravitates towards what is missing, what remains unfinished, or what might go wrong. Gratitude gently redirects some of that attention towards what is already supporting our lives. When practiced consistently, that shift influences perception. We begin noticing details we previously overlooked, not because life suddenly became perfect, but because awareness expanded.
The phrase, "these are the good days," really stayed with me. It's such an ordinary sentence, yet it carries a surprising amount of wisdom.
I think it does because it introduces perspective. Very often, we only recognize the value of a season after it has passed. We look back years later and realize those ordinary mornings, familiar routines, and simple conversations were actually precious. Saying these are the good days reminds us that today's ordinary life may become tomorrow's cherished memory. That small linguistic habit interrupts the constant rush towards whatever comes next.
The essay also connects language with attention, which I thought was fascinating. We don't usually think of everyday phrases as shaping emotional experience.
Yet they often do. Language directs attention. Attention shapes experience. Repeated experience gradually shapes identity. When we repeatedly tell ourselves that life will begin after the next achievement, we train attention toward absence. When we remind ourselves that goodness already exists alongside our ambitions, we create a more balanced relationship with the present.
Presence becomes another important theme. You describe adaptation as thriving on autopilot. That's an interesting observation because many of us move through our routines without really noticing them anymore.
That's true. The more automatic life becomes, the faster adaptation occurs. Familiarity eventually dulls perception. Presence interrupts that process. Something as simple as slowing down enough to taste a meal, notice changing seasons, or genuinely listen during a conversation restores richness to experiences that routine would otherwise flatten. Presence doesn't eliminate adaptation, but it slows its effects by allowing experience to register more fully.
You also introduce savoring, which is different from simply enjoying something.
Yes, savoring is the deliberate decision to remain with a positive experience instead of immediately moving beyond it. Imagine finishing an important project. Many people celebrate for 5 minutes before worrying about the next deadline. Savoring allows satisfaction to settle. It acknowledges achievement before attention shifts elsewhere. That practice strengthens appreciation without requiring anything external to change.
Relationships receive their own section in the essay, and I found that particularly encouraging. Unlike possessions or achievements, meaningful relationships seem capable of renewing themselves.
They do, because relationships remain dynamic. Material objects quickly become familiar because they change very little. Healthy relationships evolve continuously. People grow, conversations deepen, shared experiences accumulate. Challenges require cooperation. That complexity keeps relationships emotionally alive in ways possessions rarely can. Of course, relationships also require attention. Gratitude expressed regularly, honest communication, and shared experiences all help prevent them from becoming background.
There's a lovely balance in the essay between accepting adaptation and not becoming resigned to it. You never suggest trying to eliminate adaptation altogether.
Because that would be impossible. Adaptation isn't a flaw in human psychology, it's one of its protective features. The real invitation is becoming aware of it. When we expect excitement to soften naturally, we stop interpreting that change as evidence that something is wrong. Instead of chasing endless novelty, we begin cultivating deeper forms of satisfaction.
Toward the end, the essay becomes very practical. You offer several habits that help people step off the treadmill without abandoning ambition altogether. Could we walk through those briefly?
Certainly. The first is intentional gratitude. Each evening, identify 3 specific things you appreciated during the day. Specificity matters because it trains attention to notice real moments rather than vague concepts. The second is introducing small variations into routine. Novelty doesn't require expensive holidays or dramatic life changes. Walking a different route, trying a new recipe, or rearranging a familiar room refreshes perception surprisingly effectively. The third is verbalizing appreciation. Tell people what you value about them. Gratitude becomes more powerful when it strengthens relationships as well as awareness. The fourth is reflecting on former desires. Occasionally ask yourself what you once desperately wanted that has now become ordinary. That simple exercise restores perspective remarkably quickly.
I also appreciated the reminder that daily rituals support these practices. The essay doesn't advocate huge lifestyle overhauls. Instead, it suggests that repeated small habits gradually reshape perception.
That's very much in keeping with the broader philosophy behind Happiness Hippi. Large transformations often emerge from modest, repeated actions. A few minutes of gratitude, a moment of presence before rushing into the next task, a conversation where you deliberately express appreciation. These practices seem almost insignificant individually. Yet, over months and years, they influence how we experience ordinary life.
As we come toward the end of today's discussion, one phrase keeps returning to me. You write that happiness is less about outrunning the treadmill and more about learning to walk differently upon it. That feels like a gentle but profound shift.
I think that's exactly what hedonic adaptation ultimately teaches us, Jesse. Life will continue changing. We will continue adapting. The question isn't whether adaptation happens. The question is how consciously we live while it happens. If we combine ambition with gratitude, progress with presence, and achievement with appreciation, the treadmill loses much of its power. We stop demanding permanent emotional intensity from every success. Instead, we begin discovering richness within ordinary days. That doesn't make life smaller. It often makes it far deeper.
That's a thoughtful place to leave the conversation. Perhaps the real opportunity isn't escaping hedonic adaptation altogether, but understanding it well enough that it no longer quietly directs our lives. When we become more aware of the patterns of the mind, we stop measuring happiness only by the next achievement and begin noticing how much of life is already unfolding around us. If today's conversation resonated and you want more perspective on emotional clarity or meaningful living, begin at the Our Approach page at happinesshippie.com, and please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you for being part of this community. We will talk again soon.